Hello, I'm Nathan Willis, and I'm going to talk to you today about my research into spacing and letter fitting. Speaking of which, let's get this right out of the way. In my official work, I try to always say letter fitting, but that's not a term that necessarily clicks with people in general, at least not immediately, so I switch that around a lot. Um, Unfortunately, I'm not here to tell you that there is a mathematical formula that solves letter fitting. Instead, I'm going to talk about the methodology I'm using in my project, and in particular, how to assess letter fitting in sort of an objective manner, because it's essentially a qualitative thing when we talk about it, good or bad, that sort of thing. Um, Real brief introduction. I'm a PhD student at the University of Reading in the typography and graphic communication department. I did the master's degree in typeface design in 2016, 2017. My supervisors are Fiona Ross and Matthew Lickis, and I am fortunate enough to receive some funding from the university in a studentship. So my topic is letter fitting. The primary research question that I'm looking at is whether an algorithm can generate letter fitting that's indistinguishable from the letter fitting that a type designer would do by hand. And I say algorithmic, I used to say automated in the early days, but that suggests some things that you don't want to talk about, like instantaneousness or unattendedness. And that's not what anyone wants, but it also doesn't really fit into the workflow of designing a typeface. Whereas an algorithm can involve a person, and it also captures that notion of stages and steps, which is how we design, including the letter fitting. So to answer the first question that I usually get, I am considering kerning and side bearings as part of the same problem when I say letter fitting, because I think they are actually the same question, and I'll tell you why. In both cases, you're determining how much space should be between two glyphs. And in reality, these days, the fact that you encode some of those decisions to side bearings and some you put into kerns is really a choice that you make. As far as I'm concerned, if this is a Fred Smyer's illustration, and if you're trying to answer this question about what belongs in that space between the glyphs, that's letter fitting. It's really an implementation detail, whether you save your answer as the side bearing should the N on the Z, or you use other side bearings and make this into a kerning lookup. On the other hand, I am looking at letter fitting in the context of typeface design, not at page level spacing questions, because I believe those are very different questions. At the document or page setting typography level, you are using different pieces like paragraphs and lines, and you have different operations like changing margins and compressing glyphs, and you have a different context. You have a known text and some known physical or virtual page to fit it into. So those are not letter fitting decisions that you're making. About letter fitting itself, you need it. Even in Stoke Newington, I hope I don't have to convince everyone here of that, but let's just say it's vital for legibility and generally readability. It is also something that regular people will notice, even if they don't know as much about type design when it's wrong. Although, it has to be really wrong before people will necessarily identify it as the problem. This is a quote I really like from Walter Tracy, where he points out that it is a fundamental aspect of typeface design. And I'll come back to this quote in a second. But I also want to show you this, which you've probably seen. This is Walter Tracy's methodology for doing side bearings. And it's one of the most widely circulated systems to define letter fitting in sort of parametric terms. We can disagree on this. I think I would call that an algorithm. It's describing this as a process that's sort of that you will apply to your typeface. I guess I would say if Tracy doesn't see a contradiction between algorithms and fundamental aspects, then it's probably okay. In reality, a lot of people have looked at this question. A lot of attempts have come and gone, and this is the list that I sort of maintain just to show people. It gets out of date pretty regularly, and it's also complicated by the fact that you see the same idea from someone pop up in different projects and they rename them and so on. And suffice it to say, there's a lot of raw material out here. From a research perspective, the nitty-gritty of my research is sort of picking apart algorithms. That means, for example, assessing which things work in this part of the design space, which work in certain styles, not others. And the goal is to construct an algorithm or algorithms that people can use to generate correct letter fitting. Except that, as you probably have surmised, this word correct is problematic when you stop to think about it. There's definitely not just one fitting that's correct for a set of glyphs. At the very least, that ignores the design component, and we know that the design component is important. And you can see this in a lot of examples of display typefaces or typefaces that evoke a mood. Fitting affects how the glyphs interact with each other, so there are real decisions that have to be made design-wise. The other issue, of course, is that not everyone is going to agree with time on what the best fitting is, and that should be okay. This is a paragraph typeset by David Kindersley. Clearly knows how to do letter fitting, but in this particular example, he was showing the output of his letter fitting system Logos, and we might not all think that this is great anymore. And he had a point to make. I think it's still legible, but not everyone's going to agree that that's the best fitting. So instead of correct, what I've started saying is successful. That's just as Walter Tracy used in that quote I showed you earlier. I think it has the correct connotations to it about good or bad, but it also captures this notion that the letter fitting has to work in practice, that it's for real documents in real life that people will use, because that is what we say matters. We say that the eye decides, and it's the eye of the reader. As with optical corrections and a lot of other issues in type design, it's what it looks like in the end that matters. This raises a question for my project, though. If I am reframing the goal as identifying an algorithm that gives us successful letter fitting, then we have to ask, how do we measure the successfulness of any letter fitting, and do that in a fair and empirical way? And there are quite a few options. Don't want to go into all of those, but let's just say bird's eye view. How might we assess letter fitting and determine if it succeeds or not? Obviously, the first one, we want something that's more objective than just me saying so. There honestly just aren't formulas that we can say, oh, this fitting is 80% correct. When you get into things like metrics, that's more like analyzing existing typefaces and determining the average spacing for design. You can kind of get results there, but that's really just sort of regurgitating other decisions people have made, and it doesn't really tell you what those decisions were. Same could be said for the idea of stripping all the spacing and the letter fitting out of a font and then trying to regenerate it. It's just passing the buck to someone else. So we're left with this idea of asking people for feedback. Ideally, we would ask the experts. There's an issue of determining who is an expert, but let's just say we'll ask industry people. That is time consuming for them, so it might not always be convenient, and you might not get the numbers of people responding that you would like. So in my design, I settled on the polling the public model, and then doing my best to account for all the ways that asking the public about letter fitting could skew the results, and either guarding against those potential problems or adjusting for them as much as possible. Now, I can sort of stack the deck of the public by reaching out to people in the industry and making sure that they participate in my testing process. But to get enough numbers, we do need the public's input. There's also this question of what exactly to ask people. Yes or no, obviously not good enough. We want ideally some information down to the glyph pairing level where we can say, okay, this pairing looks right, this one looks wrong. So what I put together is a web-based testing app. If you saw me at ATypI last year in Tokyo or at TypeCon in Minneapolis, this is what I was testing out. There is a new public version of this, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. But basically the design is, it's anonymous for the participant. You just show them some specimens with an unknown test font and then ask them to mark things that look incorrect spacing wise. And then the way you do this in practice is in that pool of test fonts, you have original versions and you have versions that have been adjusted with an algorithm, and then you can compare the results that you get. You show people the algorithmically fitted version, make adjustments, and hone in on an algorithm that gives you equivalent responses to the original. The way it's set up, I'm asking people just a simple question: is this letter pair too close together or too far apart? We're also capturing some demographic and technical information, but it's generally that simple. We can imagine more complex questions to ask people, but this is what it looks like now. And if you saw it last year, it would have looked exactly like this, more or less. You can see a series of specimens and different font styles and different paragraph texts. I'll show you a couple examples here. The font is randomly chosen. The text is a mixture of random Wikipedia text and then sort of specially crafted sample words just to ensure that we get a wide variety of glyph combinations. And then whichever sample you're looking at, every specimen, there's a JavaScript utility built in where you highlight letters and then it pops up unless you mark whether they're too tight or too loose. And at the end of that, what you do as a participant is mark a sample, and then you have this, which is a record from one participant of what they have marked. And data-wise, what can we get with this method? Well, basically two things. At the end of the process, we have all the marks that everyone made for a particular typeface algorithm combination. So this, for example, is an aggregate of how people responded to this typeface in that text. And you can kind of see the trends. The orange is too tight and the blue is too loose. Plotting on these specimens is really just for illustration. So you can sort of see hot spots here, but it's just one visualization. The more randomness there is, and the more versions of a font get put out there, the less this sort of heat map approach really tells you anything. We do also get the demographic information. At the moment, it's just asking for age range, eyesight, language fluency, and then a few different takes on whether or not this person describes himself as being in the type industry, training, job, that sort of thing. There is also a little bit of technical information to record, such as the browser. Browsers don't all render the same way. But in the end, what we have is an aggregate of too tight and too loose marks from an anonymous set of people. And then we can assess whether or not there are regularly occurring problems with an algorithm, and perhaps more importantly, as we make changes to an algorithm, do the responses change? And that's very numerical stuff. The text is randomized, so what matters isn't necessarily the original text and the marks there, but how people marked different combinations of glyphs. you can see here, this is just sort of plotting letter against letter. Streaks and patterns are visible. And you can see similar shapes grouped together and glean some additional data from that. And then when you compare one typeface thing with another, completely different patterns emerge. All kinds of analysis you can do that way. What really matters, of course, is the frequency that these marks occur in relative to how often that glyph pairing appears. And of course, the other interesting question to ask is if we split people up based on the training question or the language fluency question, do we get different responses? I would say for me, the 2019 trials, I did some of that. Probably the most valuable part of last year's trials was figuring out how long people would take on a sample, how many samples they could do before they got tired of it and walked away, and that sort of thing. But I did get a first glimpse at seeing what people would mark when you showed them specimens, and that's interesting. I'll come back to that in a second. In the meantime, I think it's also interesting to keep in mind what this method does not tell us. For instance, we don't get any information about design decisions here. So aesthetics, not possible. This sort of approach can't tell you if the feel is wrong, if your nice texture is destroyed by a letter fitting decision. Indirectly, people might mark things on a sample for those reasons, but it's not being recorded that that's the reason why. The other thing, of course, is that this is all on the web, so we are not able to get data at like the print resolution level. If people print out the samples from their web browser, that's okay. I just didn't want to design a test around that because that would slow it down a lot, make it more time consuming for them and expensive, and we would restrict the number of participants that we got. You also aren't going to capture any fitting issues that come from the glyph being incorrect. So imagine something being off balance or having the contrast angle wrong. You're not going to capture that in the testing tool that I've developed. And there's ways around that, which I'll get to in a second. But you don't get much insight into the person taking the test and the conditions they're taking it under. Is the lighting bad? Did they disable anti-aliasing somehow? Are they in the back of a moving car when they take the test? That's not recorded. And then finally, these are not complex documents. So it's randomized, but the samples are still limited, and they're artificial text that someone is not reading for understanding. They're just reading to look at. So those are all real-world limitations. The question is, how problematic are they? I would say it varies. Some of this is more practical than others. On the design decisions, I think there's not really a way to quantify that meaningfully, but I also think that's okay. It's a different set of questions, the intent. On the other hand, problems with bad glyphs, we can kind of account for that by testing with sort of time-proven typefaces, especially with the less common styles. The print resolution conditions, you can't control people. There's limits to that. This is always going to be an artificial testing scenario. Like, the ideal testing would not only be a double-blind test, but you would sneak your test fonts into the New York Times and Teen Vogue or whatever. But that's not feasible either. The other big question, though, is can we trust the responses given by people who are not in the practice looking for letter fitting issues? It's a big question, especially if those people outnumber the industry people. Is the data sets that we get going to be bad because most people are not type designers? Well, the easy answer I can say is that we just ask everyone which group they're in, split the data set, and compare them. I can tell you that in the 2019 trials that I did, which were not large, I generally saw agreement between the kinds of things that those two groups of people would mark, but there are big differences in how many things they marked. On average, the type professionals marked twice as many errors on their specimens as the general public did. The actual range was, I think, 50% more to 220% more, but on average, twice as much. And almost always they were in general agreement about whether a typeface had glyphs too close or too far apart. There was one instance where they disagreed, but that was also a sample that had very, very few exposures, so I think it's too early to read too much into that. So there's going to be some effect by having all of these non-type people in the testing pool, and I just want to think about what it is. And people who do data analysis have a lot of ways to talk about noise, and I think for this sort of test it breaks down to sort of four different things. You've got randomness, which would be people think they should mark something, so they mark something even if it doesn't necessarily really reflect them thinking it's a problem. You've got outliers, which would be somebody who just has really strange opinions about letter fitting. We can have those in the type industry group as well. We just sort of assume that there'll be fewer of them. You can have people just trying to make trouble. That's pretty self-explanatory. And then there's the quantization issue, which means like problems that stem from the granularity of the measurement. Think about like a pair of glyphs that only occurs one time, one person marks it. That's a big spike in the percentages, but it's not necessarily reflective of that being a major problem. The randomness is something we hope evens out. The outliers and the troublemakers, that's sort of on the analysis side to find and discard. Quantization problems, a little more intrinsic, but I think we can account for that in the prep stage. Ultimately, though, I believe we do expect the public to produce noisy data with this test design, not to produce contradictory data. As I've started saying, we don't think that the general public likes bad spacing. We just think they don't necessarily know how to identify spacing as well as people who have done it for a long time. This is, however, an open-ended question, so please let me know if you've got thoughts about it. Moving on, the live public version of this testing tool is out. It's at the site letter.fit. Or I say it's out. It should be out. I'm actually taping this a few days in advance, so it's always possible something happened. I will just assure you that if it happens to be offline when you're looking at the video, I will put a note up that explains when it's coming back. The first version of the test is, well, it's all going to be in English. My design is sort of to stage tests in batteries, and I can't tell you anything about the algorithms themselves. That would be showing too many cards. I can tell you it's in English. I can also tell you that the first batch leans more towards regular white text typefaces. We need a lot of data there. Later rounds, we may focus more on particular weights or styles as interesting questions arise, but this is the beginning. We don't know what interesting questions are going to arise. There is no cost. There's also no prize. You do have to be 18. So please visit the site, spread the word to people you know in the type business or design business or students or whoever, and please feel free to give me feedback on how it works, and if you encounter problems or areas for improvement, I'm happy to hear that. I also want to maybe end on one last topic before time is up, which is that even though I'm not telling you about the algorithms that are in the live test group now, I can tell you that there are original fonts in there as controls, because you need controls. and even if spacing algorithms and things are not your cup of tea, maybe there's opportunities to discover some interesting things just from looking at the way people respond when asked to look at letter fitting in the original font control groups. What do people mark? It'll be interesting to find out how different are the industry people from the world at large. Are we going to see interesting patterns emerge? We'll find out. Starts on this weekend, and perhaps next year I'll have more to say from the results. In the meantime, please feel free to reach out to me about this project or just about letter fitting in general. I'm always happy to talk about it. I think that is all for now. So thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Once again, we're terribly sorry for some technical issues and with this restarting of the video. And now we are ready to start the open discussion. And please, Nathan, just press your icons of camera and microphone for me to be able to put you live and for the participants to be able to see you. Yeah, okay. They are situated on the top bar near the Bezalel logo type. Just press them, I will see them active, and then I will be able to put you live. Okay, this is weird. Like I don't even see them being active on your icon. Okay, 1 second. Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, now they are active. Okay, thank you for pressing them, and now I can put you live.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, let's check if everything works. Yeah, we can see you, we can hear you. Thanks. And so, dear participants, you can freely type your questions either to the Q&A section or it can be even in the room chat. Doesn't matter. So, yeah, I haven't seen any questions before. So if you have now something just to comment on, even just, I don't know, share your impressions from the presentation, say a word, and yeah, let's participate in the discussion.
So just so you know, I didn't have the sound turned on or I had something in front of the browser window because watching yourself on video for half an hour is terrible. So I do have my slides.
Okay, and we have. Yeah, great. Okay, so we have the first question from Frederick. Yeah. So what are the plans for software implementations?
Can you be more specific? What you mean there? Software implementations? Which software implementations? I mean, are you asking about software that does letter fitting? Okay. So you're asking about letter fitting in font editors. If you mean like long-term, I guess the strict answer is what I'm interested in is developing a model and not necessarily developing that into a product, but my intent is for that to be something that everyone can take advantage of and use. I don't have any concrete plans for what the implementation would look like. Oh, okay. So the to follow up on the follow-up there, he's asking, is it something sort of utility-like TTF auto hint, or part of the font editor? To be honest, I think that there are letter fitting issues that work well in one format and not so much in another, and I expect that you would see both kinds of implementations be useful to someone. For example, I think one of the things that's tricky to get right for something that's in a font editor is the notion that it changes all the spaces, all the spacing for you as a designer in one fell swoop. I think personally it would probably be more useful to people for things that we find to be useful algorithms to provide hints to how you do your spacing and not necessarily alter it directly for you. So I think that that's a workflow user interface issue. Is a good spacing tool something that gives you feedback as you work, or is it just something that makes a pass on its own? There's cases for both of those, I think. Is there another question in the room chat?
Yes, there was the question in the room chat. So the person named Frederick, I'm sorry, Felipe Sanchez, who's from the Font Bakery, and he's a developer and a maintainer. So were all participants observed while using the tool, or would people also participate online? Did the in-person observation of the participants or produce inputs to the research?
So in my original pilot tests, I was observing everyone. That was because it was to establish the methodology. And there were a lot of things that I could pick up on what people were doing that you wouldn't be able to observe if it's out on a website and they're visiting it on their own machine. A lot of things. A lot of the issues that I had to fix that dealt with confusion were things that it would have been really tricky to pick up just looking at results in the database. So people who misunderstood directions or who had trouble with parts of the interface, you could kind of only get that info by being there. On the other hand, as I'm sure you're aware, by me standing there next to the person, I'm having some influence on what they do. And so that's another reason that initial data set is not something I can put into final analysis, because the person who is doing the research is standing 2 feet away. That's going to change your behavior. It's just the observer effect, but it was necessary at the time, I think. I don't know. So when I said at the end that it'll be interesting just to see how people react, that's kind of what I mean, is that I've seen them one-on-one mark things, but it'll be interesting to see if different patterns emerge when it's just out in public and anything goes. So.
Okay, thanks for the answer. And we have a next question from Andres. He was just to clarify something on the test. So were you testing only algorithmic letter-fitted fonts, or you test also involved manually spaced fonts?
So in the pilot tests last year, those were essentially all control fonts, because mostly that was about getting the tool to work in the way that I wanted it to and to collect the right kind of data. So there were things about the data collection that I decided I had to change before I could put it out to a real test and have perhaps thousands of answers. So I used essentially original fonts. I did have some versions of, I did have some changes made sort of to put an error in that everyone should get and just see how many people got it. So that doesn't really count as an algorithm. That's just sort of, again, trying to cross-validate the way that the tool works. So I learned some things from that too, like what sorts of errors, if I introduce them, no one would catch, and that's important. I think on its own, and also because just figuring out what kinds of things people do and don't mark is pretty important to getting good data out of this. Like, I mean, if it comes down to it, there's things like punctuation that are really important to have spaced correctly, but if only one time out of a million someone is going to actually look at the punctuation and mark it, then this isn't a good way to judge your punctuation spacing. So yeah, that data analysis stuff is pretty vital. That was kind of a long answer. Sorry.
No. Feel free to put your thoughts. Yeah, this is a discussion. So Cesar Buttress also wrote into the room chat his question. Do you think the future of type fitting is automatization? Automatization, yeah.
I guess it kind of boils down to what you call automation. I mean, like I said about the Walter Tracy method, that is an algorithm. It's just in his book, it's an algorithm that you follow in your head and in your design tool yourself, rather than having the computer do it for you. But there's not a big difference between that and programming your font editor to do the same steps for you. So do you count that as automation or not? I mean, anybody who has worked on a large project or has a client who needs something done yesterday knows that there are going to be times when you need to speed up parts of the process, and certainly letter fitting is one of the things that people will say, this is taking too much time, I'm doing the same steps over and over again, I need to speed it up. So they would employ some automation there, but that doesn't mean that they remove themselves from the decision-making part. So it's kind of in between.
Thank you. And the discussion with Andres also continues, and he has a couple of more questions. Do you have information if type designers react differently to manual algorithmic space fonts if they know it's metric?
Right. I don't yet, but I will after running real life tests. I mean, I had a couple of instances in the pilots when I showed somebody a typeface that they were really familiar with, and in one case it was the designer of the typeface just randomly happened to be one of the people who took the test, and the responses you get from people are very different there. So I would certainly expect there to be a big difference in the way they react. And if they know how the font was spaced, I would expect that to change their opinion. I don't remember if I mentioned this specifically in the slides, but well, I think when I mentioned the question about if people do things like print out the samples, I can't prevent them from doing that. So in the live version of the testing tool, I just ask if they've done anything like that, and I assume that people who printed things out will say so. I left some room for this sort of thing as well, where like if they know that this font was algorithmically spaced, or it's a font they worked on, or they know the font and they can tell that something has been changed about it, there's a place for them to add that information. But I didn't think that I could like outright ask that question, because that's sort of putting your thumb on the scale, to say, if you recognize this font, did you notice that the spacing was or was not the same? You'd probably get some information there, but I think that would be interfering a little too much. After the big public survey stuff is done, though, it would certainly be informative to do some like interview style investigations into that sort of thing. Yeah.
Thank you all for the questions and for the answers, of course. Very interesting discussion. Even being a moderator here, like hiding, and glad to be able to to present and to listen to that. Yeah, okay. And we have a question from Anne. Yeah. She thanks for the lecture, and she would like to know, would you describe your research dealing with the study of of conventions in letter fitting, similar how a convention has been discussed in familiar letter forms under Tiger and familiar typographic patterns?
So far I've done a lot of reading, like everything I can find that has been written on the subject, but I haven't yet assembled that into a structured response, I guess. But you're definitely, it's definitely true that a lot of people have written about the topic and have, well, how would I say this? This isn't something that happens in a vacuum. And so even though I kind of tend to talk about it like algorithmic spacing is this subject of its own, it's really just part of the way people have talked about spacing and every other way. But yeah, I've gone back and read books and correspondence and things. Oh no, I didn't see it as a negative. It's a tricky question to try and encompass all the context and history like that. So. Sure. When do you think?
Yeah. What do you think will surprise you when you see the results, and what won't?
If I think it will surprise me, then it's not surprising me, right?
It's true.
No, if I understand what you mean, there would be some outcomes that would surprise me, and I may have alluded to one of them, which is that if there really is a difference between what type industry professionals say about something and what the public at large says about something, that's potentially bad news because we tell ourselves that we know what they want. We know it in detail because we spent all this time training how to see it. But yeah, if there's a case where there's big divergence between certain population groups, that would be really surprising. It would also, I think because everyone learns to read more or less the same way, you wouldn't expect to see that in the type styles that people are used to, but there could be some surprises lurking in extreme weights or in unusual styles, maybe. I don't know. What do I expect? It's kind of a multifaceted test, so I don't know how to sum up what I expect exactly. For me, I think the most interesting part of the experimental stuff is seeing how people's reactions or their responses to the spacing changes as you move within a design space. And so what I expect to see are, or what I hope to see are what sorts of patterns emerge as people see the same style, but in different weights and widths and things like that.
Yes, so thank you. And now Fiona also asks, what about applying your tests to the other scripts?
Right. So it's the way the software component is written, it's pretty trivial for me to just drop in test fonts and sample texts in any script. I think the thing that I would need to adapt would be the question, the task that I'm asking the participants to do, because the way it's set up now, it's just the simple two-option question: is the spacing too close or too far? And even going from that to asking about vertical spacing on diacritics or on floating punctuation means adding another option to the menu. and I think that's probably within reach with just some minor adjustments. And you would need more options like that to really get any data in a writing system that involves vertical placement and stacking and things like that. But I think it's doable. It becomes just trickier still the further away you move from the blunt everything on the baseline. Right, yeah. The follow-up is, would you need to separate joining and non-joining scripts? My guess would be yes, mostly just because what little I understand about text spacing in Arabic is that there are different factors to examine than the simple side-bearing issues that we use, particularly in a style that involves adjusting slant and mark placement and things like that. Definitely, it is technically possible to do the same sort of tests that revolve around feedback from experienced readers. So I think that's within reach. It would be an adjustment on the back end to correctly model the questions that I'm asking and the data that I am recording. But yeah, my hope is that I could push this forward into other scripts. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the answer, and I guess we are slightly running out of time, like a couple of minutes more. So probably we have time for one or two last questions, if you have one, of course. Yeah.
Anyone? You can contact me later if you want. That's perfectly fine.
Yes, and you are also highly welcome to the Hangout room, like after the discussion. If you still have some questions or you want to bring up some topic, please enter and participate a little bit. Okay, then I think everyone is thinking, of course, and I guess it means we're done.
Right.
That was a great time, and it's a pleasure for me to be present to this session and to host all of you.
Thank you as well.